Brethren, let's all welcome our brother Bob Cooper and enjoy the talk. Bob, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sataris and Amit, for organizing everything. Well, good evening, everyone, or good evening my time anyway. Thank you very much for tuning in. As always, I've tried to illustrate the presentation tonight with a PowerPoint presentation. As you know, I do this for two reasons, so you don't have to look at my ugly mug for the next 40 minutes or so, but it's also nice to have some images to back up what I'm going to be saying. Now, the subject here is the Knights Templars in Scotland. The subject itself, that's only one very small part of the subject. It ranges from all sorts of things like the Sinclair family, Roslin Chapel, etc., 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 all the interconnections between these subjects. So the focus here is quite narrow. But even then, this narrow focus has given rise to a fairly lengthy talk. So if I start talking quickly, you'll know that I'm trying to cram the last few images and talk and speech into the end of the talk. So let's just bash on, and hopefully we'll certainly have time, I'm sure, for question and answers. So we're going to so let me just get myself organized here. I just got a message for some reason saying that my graphics card might not cope with the images, but we'll manage, I'm sure. So let me just share the screen with you. So I want to introduce you to a very famous American philosopher who has a great deal of insight. You'll know him as soon as you see him. What is interesting is that he sometimes comes up with some cracking little quotes. And of course, we're talking about no less than this individual who is, of course, quite famous in the world. Maybe not the philosophical world, but he comes up with some very, very interesting things. Now, you'll see that the quote I've used here is about facts. And of course, the reason for that is that a lot of people who write about the Knights Templar, Scotland, Roslin Chapel, etc., take this view that facts are actually useless and that we should focus very much on things that are not facts. What I'm going to do tonight as a historian, an academic historian, as well as a Masonic historian, is give you some insight into the problems that some of these writers have created for Scottish Freemasonry. And we've got to remember that Scottish Freemasonry is considerably different from Freemasonry anywhere else. And that means that when we have people who are not Scottish Freemasons talking about Scottish Freemasonry, they usually make some pretty grave errors, and we'll try and highlight them as we go along. Let me see if we can get this thing to do things. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to look at this from a historian's point of view. So if you have very firm beliefs in things that you don't want me to challenge, then perhaps you want to leave the meeting now, because I'm going to perhaps dent some of your most romantic of notions, shall we say, because we're going to look at facts. And facts are always important to the historian because facts are nearly always supported by actual evidence. So we're talking about evidence that is in existence and not opinion. And that's very important. And that's exactly what historians are trained to do, is to exclude any bias and to use evidence and not opinion. So that's what the focus is on tonight's talk. So I know this is being recorded, so I'm not going to go through all this text. But the reason I've given it on the screen is that when the recording's available, you will be able to go back to it and see the timeline, if you like. Now, you'll notice that I have said this timeline is from before 1307, and this is crucially important because nearly everything that happened before 1307 is not in dispute. There is a great deal of information about the Knights Templar prior to 1307. It's after this year, 1307, which was when the mass arrest took place in France and then later elsewhere. It's after 1307 that some recent authors have disputed what happened after the mass arrests. That is for your information prior to 1307. After 1307, this is what some of these alternative historians say happened after Philip the Fair had arrested the Knights Templar in France. It is said that these mass arrests were, some of the Knight Templars were made aware that they were going to be arrested, and they were able to flee to the port of La Rochelle, where they took ships to Scotland. And so, of course, this is exactly why I'm interested in this, because apparently they came to my home country, and in particular to a part of the country that I know very, very well indeed, Argyllshire and the Mull of Kintyre, on the far west of Scotland. And in fact, I was there just 4 weeks ago, and I had glorious weather, I have to say. And I got some rather nice photographs, but I'm not going to show you them tonight. But we will talk about some of the things that are in existence on the west coast of Scotland, and indeed, if you're ever in that part of the world, I think you would want to have a look at some of the things that are lying around, basically, although they're well cared for. I would warn you, if you go to this part of Scotland, you are on one-track roads. That is a single track with the occasional passing place, and sometimes not even tarmac roads. So you have to be a wee bit careful. I have a little bit of warning about that. So the story goes that the Knights Templar went to Argyll because it was isolated, and they stayed there for 7 years until the Battle of Bannockburn, where they suddenly charged onto the field of battle and defeated Edward II's army. And under Robert the Bruce, Scotland was independent for a few centuries. And as a reward for the Knights Templar charging onto the field of battle, he made the Knights Templar into the Order of Freemasons. Apparently this was done so that if the Pope or the Church asked the King of Scotland if there were any Knight Templars in Scotland, he could reply that there were no Knight Templars. And I suppose, according to the letter of the description, he's correct, because according to the popular authors, they had now been renamed the Freemasons. There's a variety of different opinions about what happened at the Battle of Bannockburn. I will talk a little bit about that towards the end. And then we end up with the idea that because Robert Bruce had given a safe haven to the Order of Knight Templars, they basically went underground, hid, and that Rosslyn Chapel was built to house the treasure that they had brought back from Jerusalem when they had been billeted there on the Dome of the Rock. And in fact, it comes pretty well, or more recently, to the point where Bonnie Prince Charlie was apparently made a Grand Master of the Order of the Templars in 1745. So that's quite a different history from what we do know from evidence about the Knights Templar after 1307. So let's look at where these ideas come from and what do we make of them? You know, what do we think about them? Well, we know that there's a huge amount of evidence written, and in particular, there is supposedly evidence of their existence between 1307 and the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, 7 years, particularly some gravestones in the west of Scotland, particularly Argyllshire, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So the first claim that Knight Templars in Paris were forewarned of the impending mass arrests. Now, there is no evidence for that whatsoever. That idea comes from the fact that Philip the Fair claimed that after the preceptory in Paris had been raided by his knights and his servants, he says there was no treasure, and therefore the conclusion has been reached that, well, if he said there was no treasure to be had, then the Knight Templars must have taken it away before he got there. However, we've got to remember that King Philip actually admits trying to steal the treasure, but he denies actually having got it. So the conclusion that that means that the Knights Templar had taken it away seems to me to be a little bit tenuous, to say the least. So anyway, they apparently left La Rochelle and they went to Argyll, and Argyllshire is let me see if we can find this for you. Argyllshire is this piece right there, and below that is the Mull of Kintyre. Now, the reason I'm showing you this map is that the claim is made that because the Knights Templar were heretics and Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated by the Pope, this was a safe haven. The first problem with that, of course, is that although the Knights Templar were heretics, Scotland had not been excommunicated. You don't excommunicate a country, you excommunicate individuals. And so Robert the Bruce was excommunicated, but the population of Scotland was not. They continued to attend church just like they always had. Argyll apparently had been chosen because it's thinly populated, and the Knight Templar could hide there with impunity, and therefore their treasure was unlikely to be discovered. And English forces were not interested in this area. Now, one of the reasons why they apparently came to this part of Scotland was because it was unpopulated. Now, that's simply not true. This whole area of Scotland, including the Outer Isles, which are over here, sorry, not on the map, this whole area was known as the Kingdom of the Isles, under the control of a chap called Angus Ogg, who was an ally of Robert the Bruce. So thinly populated it was not. In fact, traveling by sea was by far the fastest, easiest and safest means of travel rather than across land. So this was a very populated part of Scotland. It was the interior that was thinly populated, not the coastline. However, as I've just said, Robert the Bruce was excommunicated, but not the population. And the other difficulty we have with the Knight Templars coming to this part of Scotland was that that area was Gaelic speaking, whereas the Knight Templars were French. And so the sudden arrival of any number of people that could not speak the local language, Gaelic, would have been a cause for comment. But there is no indication at all that the Knights Templar had suddenly appeared in the midst of this bustling community of Gaelic-speaking people. So here we have a typical grave slab, which is claimed to show a Knight Templar who had died whilst hiding in Argyll between the year 1307 and 1314. And I have to say, because of the dozens, if not hundreds, of the grave slabs, there must have been a huge number of Knight Templars who came to Scotland, because they all died within this 7-year period. And this is apparently, according to many authors, this is where these gravestones come from. Now, I have to say that we know, because this is Angus-Og territory, the lordship of the Isles, that there's a lot known about this particular kingdom. It was not, Scotland, of course, was not a united kingdom at this time. So the lordship of the Isles was a kind of separate domain. And so we know quite a lot about it. It's been well, or reasonably well documented. And I want to show you why we have problems using these gravestones in the west of Scotland. And the one you see here is a composite. The one on the left is a composite of the one in Argyllshire. The one on the left is from the same period. And it's from the Templar Church in London, one of the gravestones. And I put it there for comparison, and I think you can immediately see the differences are quite stark. The shield is different, the chainmail is different, and because we do know quite a lot about what was happening in England at the time, a comparison, a legitimate comparison, can be made between the two. And so this particular gravestone, as I say, a composite, but it contains all the elements that you can see. There is no chainmail. There is a helmet of a kind. There may be a chainmail or a coif which surrounds the neck. But you can see here that this is actually a garment known as an acton, akiton, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. What I'm getting at here is that the difference between this, which is claimed to be a Knight Templar, is quite different from what we know. So between 1307 and 1737, and that, of course, I've chosen because it's a nice round figure, it's a 400-year gap. Apparently, the Knights Templar were underground, and that simply means that there was no evidence. So the assumption is that they did exist, but they were unknown, or left no trace of their existence for a period in excess of 400 years. Now, as a historian, that's a bit of a problem, because 400 years is an incredibly long time for anyone, generation after generation. You've got to remember, at this time, a generation is typically 30 years. So we're talking in excess of 13 to 14 generations of Knights Templar managed to stay hidden from the eyes of the world. So you can begin to see why some historians have a problem with this. Chevalier Ramsay, very quickly, this chap here was a Scotsman. He was a tutor to Bonnie Prince Charlie, and he was a Freemason. We know he was initiated in a lodge in London in 1730. He is famous in Masonic circles because he gave an oration at the Grand Lodge of France. Whether he did or not, we're not absolutely sure, but 2 copies of the oration he gave or intended to give remain in existence. And what he says in his oration is that Freemasonry has nothing at all to do with the craft of stonemasonry in Scotland, of which at this point in time there were well in excess of 100 stonemasons lodges in Scotland actually working Masonic degrees. So it's a bit of a problem, but you've got to remember that this chap, Andrew Ramsay, is actually selling something to the Grand Lodge of France. And they are not interested. They're all aristocrats. They would throw their hands up in horror if anybody suggested to them that they were descended from a bunch of stonemasons, Dirty Hands Brigade, in other words. So he knows his audience well. He's giving them something to consider that they would like and enjoy, and that is chivalric orders beginning in the Crusades and coming up to the present day. And they joined Freemasonry in their droves because of Andrew Ramsay's sales pitch, if you like. And that's just to let you see one of the copies of his oration. They were upper class, actually, probably 90% aristocrats, but they were all people who were interested in chivalry, and the romance of chivalry. And of course, at that time, they had no knowledge of what was going on in Scotland. And so Andrew Ramsay was able to make this claim, and there was no easy way of checking what he said, whether it was true or not. So what happens, and we're jumping a little bit further forward, the 18th century sees the age of Romanticism begins. It begins with this James Ossian Macpherson, and it continues all through the next 100 years, well into the Victorian era, when Romanticism is one of the dominant themes of society at the time. And so Romantic Scotland comes into being, and Sir Walter Scott, brother Sir Walter Scott, is one of the main proponents of this idea of looking at the romantic idea of society, that we are all essentially chivalric in nature. We should always look after the downtrodden, the widows, the orphans, etc., etc. He writes a lot of books, such as Rob Roy, and these books are reasonably good sellers, but it's when he starts talking to an international audience, and in particular Ivanhoe, in which the Knights Templar feature greatly. It's with that novel that Sir Walter Scott becomes an international celebrity, and he is, of course, a romanticist, and he promotes this view of the world, which is carried all across Europe, and all sorts of other people. In fact, Rossini wrote an opera based on the novel Ivanhoe. And I would encourage you to get out Ivanhoe and read it again. I think it's a Masonic novel. I'm not going to tell you why, but I would encourage you to read it. Now, I know the language is a little bit difficult. Well, it's 200 years old. And so the language is a little bit tortuous, but if you start reading it and persevere with it, it does become easier to read and understand. So I would encourage you to read it. I mean, it's free on the internet, and it's actually a great story anyway. And as you know, there was an Oscar-nominated film with Robert Taylor and Elizabeth Taylor. I can't remember when it was made, but that was on cable just recently. So where did the Order of Knights Templar story come from? Let me just mention, of course, although in Ivanhoe, Walter Scott talks about the Knights Templar, he's very disparaging of the Knights Templar. He does not like them very much at all. In fact, the Knights Templar and Ivanhoe are the villains of the piece. And that didn't stop, I have to say, didn't stop the Scottish Knight Templars, the Scottish Masonic Knight Templars, from asking Sir Walter Scott to become the Grand Master of the order. Needless to say, he declined. I think he said he was too busy or something. However, the origins of the story about the Battle of Bannockburn, the Knights Templar, connections with Rosslyn Chapel, etc., etc., all appear in this history written by James Burns, or Burness, who is a distant relative of Robert Burns through his uncle's side. He writes a traditional history for the Scottish Knight Templars, and he does say in this publication, please remember that this history that you asked me to write is fiction. I'm writing it because you want a traditional history for the order. So this traditional history fits in very well with what we know about Freemasonry generally. All the branches of Freemasonry have a traditional history and never will meet. You will not hear anything about King Solomon's Temple if you are in the Red Cross. Vice versa, if you're in Royal Arch Freemasonry, you'll never hear anything about the ritual of the Order of Knights Templar. And that's simply because a traditional history is designed as a vehicle to transmit some moral and ethical lessons to the members. It is not intended to be taken as literally true. And that's the important thing to remember about a traditional history. It's the authors from the late 1980s that mix up our traditional histories and get them woven into a single story. Of course, you never hear that story, that intertwined story, in any of our Masonic meetings. You only hear about it in books, books that are sold to anyone who's interested. So a traditional history is intended to convey a moral lesson. It is not intended to be literal truth. It's fictional, and the best way I can ask you to think about them is to consider them as parables. Say, for example, the parable of the Good Samaritan. It does not matter whether the Good Samaritan was a real person, where he lived, etc., etc. It's what he did that's important. So the parable is a story, a fictional story, which is used to convey the moral of look after your fellow man, very briefly. So it all began with this book, 1988, The Temple and the Lodge, and that began a cottage industry on all sorts of similar subjects, some of which are mentioned here. And of course, in the academic world, they say that a good fictional story always ends up as a novel, which in this case, of course, it did, with the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, which of course was an international bestseller. I think last I heard 51 million copies. I would quite like 10% of that myself. But in any event, a tremendous read. But of course, remember, it is a novel, and therefore, by definition, it is fiction. It is not true. For instance, I want to just quickly mention things like this, and this is what a lot of these authors have missed. They've missed what we call contemporary evidence, that is material written at or about the time that is being discussed. And we know a lot about Robert the Bruce, Bannockburn, the life of Robert the Bruce, Angus Ogg, the Lordship of the Isles, etc., etc., from this book that's written very shortly after the death of Robert the Bruce. And it is, you can say, this particular version has a modern English translation to go with it. And this kind of source is never actually mentioned by many of these authors. And of course, a historian will always go back to looking at the original evidence, the first evidence, the earliest evidence, and work up to the present day. A lot of modern authors begin with what they know today and apply it to the past. That is actually quite bad history. So if you really, really want to go into detail about this, you might like to think about this particular book. Unfortunately, it is out of print. You might be able to get it on the secondhand market if you're really keen. I think there are still some available at Grand Lodge of Scotland. But if you really want to know more in great detail about the Sinclair family, Rosslyn Chapel, the Knights Templar, Scottish Freemasonry, etc., 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 this is probably the one for you. So, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found that to be of interest, and I hope that it will get you thinking enough to actually ask some questions. And as you probably guessed, I haven't timed this. I haven't got a clock in this room, so I don't know how long that took. So apologies if it was too long, and apologies if it's too short.
Thank you, Bob. That was 30 minutes.
Oh, okay. Right. Well, I was talking kind of fast towards the end. But anyway, well, even more time to talk, I suppose.
So Tyrus, over to you, son.
Thank you, Ami. I'm logging off from my other device because my computer is dying on me. So great. We have several questions, starting with Colin Jackson. Colin.
Hello, Bob. What a pleasure to hear
Hello.
you talk, as always.
Good, thank you.
I think the thing I like most about your talks is that even though we come at history from opposite ends of the spectrum, everything that you say is always fascinating. The question I have to say to you, you've basically said that as far as you're concerned, the lack of evidence of Knights Templars activity after 1307 makes the suggestion to you that none of it happened.
Well, partly, sorry to interrupt, Colin, partly the lack of evidence and partly because what is said is opinion. Dan Brown is opinion. So anyone can offer an opinion, and that's the problem as I see it.
Yep. We will all have ours, and of course, I'm sure we will both accept that ours are different. But my question to you is, even though there's no written evidence of Knights Templars activity within Scotland after 1307, there is, as you're undoubtedly well aware, plenty of evidence of the Knights Hospitallers after 1307. And there is, from those records, a understanding that people who were Knights Templar, even though the two orders were at one time sworn enemies, actually joined and adopted the teachings and way of life of the Hospitallers. Is it not possible, therefore, that the reason that the Knights Templar as an order left no evidence effectively after 1307, although they may be anecdotal, that some of them survived by, for want of a better term, jumping ship to their enemies?
Well, yes, the trial of the Templars, both in Scotland and in England, shows that the Templars were made to join other orders, not just the Hospitallers, I have to say. They joined other knightly orders here and across Europe. Portugal's a classic example. The difference is that the Scottish Knight Templars were tiny in comparison because the population was tiny. So the number of Knight Templars in Scotland who could have been absorbed into another order was incredibly small in comparison to the size of the order in Europe. Now, the other thing, and again, this is part of the problem where people don't look at the evidence, what actually happened here in Scotland, and we're blessed with a lot of material, the Knights Templar properties were transferred to the Order of St. John, the Hospitallers, and their chartulary, that is a list of all the property that was transferred from the order when it was suppressed, still exists. So we can look at that kind of record and work out how many there were. Now, there was only 2 preceptories in the whole of Scotland, and from what we can gather from the evidence is that there was only 2 Knight Templars in each preceptory, and they were essentially rent collectors. They were not fighting knights. So you can see what other problems that leads to. For example, they never went to where they had established bases in Scotland. Apparently, according to these authors, they went to isolated and supposedly deserted parts of Scotland instead of going to where they had preceptories, which I find kind of odd. So there's lots of holes, if you can. Now, just to finish on your point, you're absolutely right. I have no problem with somebody saying to me, I believe that the Knights Templar left France, went to Scotland with their treasure, lived underground for 4 centuries or 14 generations until they pop up to make Bonnie Prince Charlie their Grandmaster. I have no problem with that at all. The problem arises when they say, and I can prove it. And then I say, aha, you're now on my territory as a historian. Let's have a look at your proof. And it's where the proof, the evidence that they use that falls down. And so if it's a belief, I have no problem with that. No problem whatsoever. It's when they then start throwing evidence, so-called evidence at me, that I have a problem. Because I analyze the evidence and it doesn't stack up. So if they're going to tell me that, just leave it at a belief, and I'm happy.
That's fine. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Colin.
Someday I'm sure that we will have a debate that others I'm sure will enjoy massively. And you're more likely to be right on the Templars than I am, and I'm more likely to be right on the Hospitallers than you are.
Thank you, Colin. Philippe.
Hello, Bob. Before I ask my question, I just wanted to say that I've sent you an email to your curator address. I hope it was delivered properly. And well, my question is fairly similar to Colin's. I wanted to ask you if there is any historical evidence of any communication attempts before the dissolution of the order between different regions such as Iberian Peninsula, France, and the British Isles, and the same question after the dissolution of any communication between the superseding orders such as the Hospitallers or Orders of Christ. Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're going so far back that communications were rare anyway. So anything that was written really hardly survives at all. So basically what I'm saying is no, from what I understand, there is very little. What may exist is likely to be in the Vatican, because prior to 1307, well, in fact, actually prior to 1312, to be accurate, 1312 was when the Templars were officially suppressed by the church. So anything from before 1312, any sort of written evidence, any written material would be in the Vatican archives. Now, I do know that I think maybe 8, 9, or perhaps 10 years ago, the Vatican released a lot of papers relating to the Knights Templar, where they admitted that they had been wrongly accused of heresy, and indeed wrongly convicted of heresy. Unfortunately, none of those documents, as far as I can see from that publication, confirm the idea that they came to Scotland. What we do know about the order in Portugal was the king there, and I forget his name, but the king at the time said basically to the Pope, you want me to disband this elite fighting force? You've got to be kidding me. And he didn't. He simply renamed them the Order of Christ, I believe, is what their name was. So they continue to exist in Portugal in particular, I think. But as far as I know, there is no actual written evidence of communication between the Knights Templar in Portugal, Spain, and particularly Scotland, which is obviously my area of expertise.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Philippe. Georgina.
Oh, hello. Thank you. It was very interesting. I have a question regarding the Templars that are believed to have been in Argyll and the cemetery where you said all the gravestones are. And you showed us a picture of the knights and pointed out the akiton or akiton that they were wearing, which you thought was more a tunic or a doublet. But in actual fact, an akiton is an arming doublet, which is worn under armor. So it could have been previous. And if it was compared to the picture of the knights in London, that one you showed, could it not have been, because that was later, could it not have been that they improved their armor, so therefore their shield became bigger?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That is an undergarment, but we know from the accounts of the Battle of Bannockburn, for instance, that these warriors from Argyll did not have armor. And that's simply because it was horrendously expensive to make. It had to be made to measure for the individual. And unfortunately, the guys in the west coast of Argyll simply couldn't afford that kind of thing. And so we know that that's exactly how they dressed, but without overlaying it with armor or even chainmail. So it was a kind of wadding garment, padded with like a cylindrical tubes, if you like, sewn together. That's about the best way I can describe it. So we do know a lot about it, and that's why I showed the two kinds of knights that we know about. The one in Argyll, or the ones in Argyll, and the ones in London. They are quite different, although they come from the same time.
Thank you.
Sure, I'm just trying to see if
It
I
was
can
early
find
on.
some, but carry
And the
on.
other thing was, sorry, the other thing
Sure.
was quickly, you said that they more or less all died at the same time. And surely that could have been because of a pandemic or disease or something like that.
Yeah, well, hundreds of them must have died in a 7-year period, which frankly I find a little bit difficult to accept, because, you know, there wasn't very many in the first place. So let me just show you. So I don't know if you can see that image. This is an image I took just a few weeks ago. There are more than, there are dozens and dozens of these stones.
Oh, these are the ones in Argyll?
Yes, yes. This is only
okay.
one site. Now, what happens is that a lot of these authors will use one of these slabs in their book. They don't mention that, I mean, you can see there's a whole row of these, and that's only at one place. There are there's at least 16 sites like this with dozens of these slabs all over the place. But if you read the books, you would not be wrong to think there's only one or two. There are lots, basically.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Georgina. Simon, reader.
Hello, thank you very much. Another great presentation. You said early on there was a bullet point list, and you said the pre 1317 stuff is not disputed. One of your bullet points said 1306 there was an invite to discuss with the Templars and the Hospitallers. And I can't remember exactly what you said, and I think it was like an amalgamation that you were talking about the invite.
That's right.
Was it rejected, or did it happen and just didn't come to an agreement?
Well, no, de Molay, the guy who ended up being burnt at the stake, he took a party of Knights Templar back to Paris for this sit-down discussion of an amalgamation, but they were going there to fight an amalgamation. They went there, and the Knight Hospitallers didn't attend. So actually, I suspect, but can't be sure, I suspect it was a put-up job, that they were invited because the powers that be were going to do them in, and that's exactly what happened. And the Knights Hospitaller, you know, they well, as I say, they didn't attend the meeting.
Excellent, thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Stephen Cadwell.
Hi, just a sort of quick change of subject. I noticed on one of the slides you were mentioning Victorian authors and spent a lot of time on Sir Walter Scott. The little bit that jarred with me is that his date of death is 1832.
Yes, that's incorrect.
Which means he's no Victorian.
Yes, it was 1822, I think. So that's a typo. But I'm quite sure somebody is now Googling Sir Walter Scott and will be able to correct us, so that for the next time I give that presentation, I can have the date correct. But yes, you're absolutely right. I think 1832 was the time the king came to Scotland or something. I can't remember, but the date sticks in my mind for a reason. Don't know what.
Yeah. Anyways, just something struck me, and I thought I'd ask. But thank you for that answer.
Thank you, Stephen. Mark, David.
Hi guys, thanks for having me. A really interesting lecture, thoroughly enjoyed it. Just got a quick question regarding what you mentioned about the traditional histories of the order. As you mentioned, it was kind of, you know, it was written as, you know, as a piece of fiction. I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that a little bit. What was, you know, what was the point of having to create a piece of fiction in order to document the order's history?
Well, you mean this piece written by Burns or Burness?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, you talked about the traditional history being written as a work of fiction, and you kind of. I just wondered if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure. Well, we know that, I mean, Freemasonry is allegorical in nature. So our good friend H.A. himself, who features in the Third Degree, is a completely fictional character. He does not exist in Scripture. There is an H.A. in the Old Testament, but it's not our H.A. Sorry
to just jump in. I must tell you, I'm only an entered apprentice at the moment.
All right, okay. Well,
sorry.
That's why I mentioned HA. All right. Well, in that case, what we have, I suppose, is that in every branch of Freemasonry, we have a story which teaches you Masonic lessons. And the best way to do that is to have a parable. Now, you can't have hundreds of, or lots and lots of parables for one order. So every order has its own parable, its own traditional history. And as I said, you don't get told about another branch of Freemasonry's parable when you're in the lodge. You only get told the parable that's appropriate to craft Freemasonry, lodge Freemasonry. What's happened is these enterprising authors have gathered together all our separate traditional histories, all our separate parables, and interwoven them to make one long narrative that encompasses everything we do in Freemasonry. And of course, the problem with that weaving together of the traditional histories is that it only exists in these books. It doesn't exist within Freemasonry. And so that's another problem for me, not only as a Freemason, but as a Masonic historian, because I can clearly see the histories are separate. Now, the history, very quickly, the history provided by James Burness or Burns was because at that point in time when the order was created in Scotland, we were using the French story about the Knights Templar, and the Scots wanted their own story. And of course, Burness, being a Scotsman, invented something that was very Scottish, the Battle of Bannockburn, etc., etc. So that's where that comes from. Sorry, a long answer for a short question.
No, that's great. Really interesting stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Hoffman.
Robert, I always enjoy your lecture. One thing that we keep not understanding, that everything about craft, Royal Arch, Knight Templar is a story within a story. And the only thing that you're going to get out of it is you change your moral and your behavior and you become a better man or a woman.
Yeah, absolutely.
Taking it so rigidly about what's happening with the Knight Templar and what's going on from France and then into Scotland and into Portugal, into Canada and all of that one, is just belonging the story that they kept going and going and going. But I can't see any proof that they did exist in the 1400 or 1500 or 1600. There is no proof at all that they continue to exist rather in Scotland or in Portugal. So how you explain the stories that we're hearing right now, that what happened was a proof that they did exist?
Okay, well, many of these popular authors describe this in the following terms. They call it an underground stream of knowledge, and that's the term that's commonly used. So it's a way of not explaining what's actually going on during this 400-year period. Now, think about it in this sense. What they do is they say this is a pipeline from the 14th century to the 18th century. It's a pipeline that you can see, but you can't see what's inside it. So in other words, they're saying to you, believe in the pipe, but we're not going to tell you what's inside the pipe. And that, again, is the problem that academic historians have with that kind of a story. The pipe may or may not exist, but nobody will tell us what's in it.
I have no problem with telling the story.
No. That's the belief.
For example, they're all asked, the three characters of the all asked never existed at the same time. And
Absolutely.
You're right about HA, only existed 47 years after Christ was born. But brilliantly of making the ceremony the way it is,
Sure.
to bring characters to encourage you to change, it's
Sure.
absolutely brilliant. Maybe that's what the Knight Templar is trying to do, is trying to convince you that they are on the right track by making the story more romantic and enjoyable.
Absolutely. Well, that's why we have 6 orders of Knights Templar, 1 Masonic and 5 not Masonic. And the other 5 will happily take your money, and their sales pitch is, you don't need to be a Freemason to join the Knights Templar. Skip all that craft and Royal Arch stuff, come straight to us, and we'll make you a Knight Templar as long as you pony up £1,000 or whatever it is. And so they're happy to do that. And unfortunately, a lot of Freemasons, or a lot of people who are thinking about being Freemasons, are really interested in Knights Templar, and they think, oh, well, you know, it's going to take me years to become a Masonic Knight Templar, and they go straight into these other Knight Templar orders, and they never become Freemasons. So they never learn. They never learn actually what you're describing, which is sad.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you, Othman. Mike Saunders.
Thank you very much, Robert, for that presentation. Very interesting insofar that I've now learned something more about Knights Templar. I've been in Freemasonry for a relatively short time compared to, I'm sure, a lot of the members that are signed in. But I have, and I am a member of Craft, Chapter, Mark, and Ram. And I understand, I believe, the connections between them. They're all revolving around a similar message. I'm wrestling with trying to understand how Knights fit into the story of those 4 orders to which I currently belong.
Well, I think first thing is, very quickly, you have to look at the historical dates, you know, the dates. The Knights Templar are, Masonically speaking, the Knights Templar are a relatively recent manifestation of Masonic activity. So here in Scotland, the first lodges are recorded in minute books from 1598, and it's another 200 years or more before the Knights Templar appear here in Scotland. And again, this is thanks for the question. It means I can mention a very important fact, that, you know, for that 200 years of Freemasonry in Scotland, it's interesting to note that none of these minute books, 200 years worth, make any mention of the Knights Templar whatsoever. So the Masonic Knight Templars are a relatively new addition to the Masonic family. So it doesn't fit. It's not like a jigsaw puzzle. There's no nice, neat joins. It's just a very interesting story that the Masons have used to increase their ability to teach moral and ethical lessons.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Jimmy.
Oh, forgot to unmute there, sorry. Thank you very much. Very interesting. I fully agree that the Vatican probably does hold a lot of more evidence. As was proved several years ago when I actually found the pardon that was issued by the Pope, which they'd misfiled, as they put it, which is why it took nearly 800 years to find again. What my question would be more about is, where did you think that the fleet from La Rochelle actually disappeared to?
That's a very good question. The first thing is, where is the information about the fleet? And that's the first question. I can find no evidence. Now, this is back to this evidence question. I can find no written material whatsoever until the year 1989 that there was a Templar fleet in La Rochelle. So that's an idea that only came into being within the last 40 years. And so this is another problem, that it's never mentioned from 1307 until 1989. So a 600-year plus gap, and then all of a sudden in 1989, a fleet appears. If anybody has got any actual evidence of the existence of a fleet, rather than the suggestion that a fleet existed, I'd be delighted to find out.
I've seen that they have had.
Yes, they had
some ships. I think about 20 at one point they got up to. That was in the Crusade.
That's right. Sometimes they owned them. More often than not, they hired them from the people like the Venetians and the Genoese. But we're talking specifically about a fleet at La Rochelle, and I can find nothing about any Templar ships at all at the port of La Rochelle.
Yeah. Thank you very much for clearing that one up. It's always a bit of that sort of.
Me.
Wonder where that came into.
Thank you, Jimmy. Ewan.
Good evening, Bob. I hope it's drier your way than it is down here in Leith. You were looking for the dates. Walter Scott, 1771 to 1832, and it was 1822 that he directed the George IV's visit to Leith.
That's the day I was thinking of. Thanks for that. Yeah,
that's where he was put up in pink tights when he wore the kilt. But apparently, Walter Scott actually met Robert Burns, when he was about 16, when Burns was in Edinburgh. Thought that might be useful for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that.
Great. Thank you, Ewan.
I do love it when all these historians and researchers speaking to each other.
Right. Once again, Bob, it's been a pleasure to have you with us again. You're practically part of the family, the extended family of Freemasons Without Borders. Brethren, next week we're delighted to welcome Most Worshipful Brother Hugh Young, who served as Grand Master of Alberta, Canada from 1997 to 1998. And his very special talk will be entitled The Development of Freemasonry Across Canada. So, brethren, thank you once again for being with us, and looking forward to seeing you next week.
Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you.
God bless.
Bye.
Thanks, Johnny.
Need to send my mug.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Okay,
Well,
bye,
thank
everybody.
you. Everyone stay safe.
Well, keep safe.
Bye,
everybody.
Thank
Safe.
you.
Bye.
Thanks very much for a very good talk. It was
Bye,
great.
everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
See you all next week.
Thank you, Amit.
Thank you, Nilaven. Bye.
Good night.